Good evening, everyone. I am Diana Beatty, member of Practical Islamic Spirituality, and I am going to try to get us started with Muharram this year and talk about briefly how we can get the most out of this and what this all is. So, next slide. So first, a couple things since there are some people in this chat that are not members of Practical Islamic Spirituality, just an overview of how the group functions, and I think we would like to ask that those norms continue in this chat. So the purpose of our group is such that people can learn about the faith without judgment in terms of the types of questions they could ask or ideas they could express, offer support to one another. We emphasize moderation versus extremism. We expect that things will be discussed academically and respectfully, and that non-Muslims, non-Shias can find an open and objective way to learn about Shia Islam, regardless of whether they had an interest in converting or not, for pretty much whatever reason. And we've experimented briefly with some other chats. What we did was Zoom. We are looking for alternative ways because we don't own a Zoom account. But what we experienced in Zoom is that we have an organic beginning and ending time. So if you need to come and go because your prayer time comes, we're all in different time zones, whatever, or you just need to go to bed, whatever it is. Of course, you can leave at any time. You can come back at any time and see if the meeting is still going on. So just know that that is fine. And I'd also like to raise, the way we're trying this meeting tonight, we need to discuss if we want to continue to do it that way. A couple concerns I have about this way is the chat that, people don't, and me included, do not like getting those chat messages, notifications when we're not actually in the video chat. So like all the messages of people saying I can't come or thanks for adding me, they're nice, but you don't always want to get those. You just want to come to the video. So I don't know if there's a way we can work around that. We thought the chat feature would be nice so that people can chat during the video itself, during the video chat itself, because some people prefer to type rather than talk, just to make that as an option, because that was popular when we were using Zoom. Another concern that I have is that with this kind of video chat, members can add other members. And so let's say I add Susie, Susie could add Mary, and then Mary could add somebody else, and that person could add somebody else. And pretty soon we lose control of who is in this video chat. And that can be concerning for security reasons and for the norms of the meeting to try to keep it running the way we would like these items here mentioned in A through E. So those are a couple concerns I have about this method. I don't necessarily have any alternatives to propose, maybe just a straight old Facebook room, but then we would lose the chat feature. So keep that in mind as we're going through this. What do you like? What do you not like? What would work better for you? Do you have any free alternatives that are accessible to as many people in different places around the world as possible? Okay, so we are talking about Muharram, and so, not everybody is Muslim here, or has limited experience, different backgrounds. Why is this even a thing? So let's talk about that. Muharram is a month on the Islamic calendar, which is a lunar calendar. It is the first month of the year. So when the moon is born, you can start to see the crescent. Then we start a new month, and that is supposed to happen this evening in North America. And so then it will be 1442 on the Islamic calendar, I believe. And Muharram is that first month. And then Ashura stands for the 10th day of that month. I think the Arabic, it means something related to 10. I don't speak Arabic. Karbala is a place in Iraq where this event that all of this whole phenomena is based around took place. Arba'in is referring to the 40 days after this event, and in general 40 days after someone's death or something like that. We often have a commemoration of that event, the person passing, different things like that. And there are some reasons for that, some of which are cultural, some which might be based in a hadith or oral tradition, written traditions from Islam, so on and so forth. And then there are also key characters or people that are related in this event, some of which have multiple names and some of which are emphasized more than others, depending on who is telling the story, which I will talk a little bit more about. So that's kind of the overview of the vocabulary. But so what happened, in a very brief nutshell, is that there was an event where the grandson of the prophet, prophet of Islam, Muhammad, peace be upon him and his family, and some people with him, including his sister and some other relatives and some loyal followers of his, they ended up on this plain of Karbala and against a vast army. They were greatly outnumbered. And it is seen today as kind of a stand of principle, where although the side of Imam Hussein, peace be upon him, was not victorious, a lot of them died. There were some survivors who were taken prisoner and whatnot. So in that sense, they lost the battle, if we want to call it a battle. There is a claim today that the response to that event was such that it mobilized people in a way and rejuvenated Islam in a way to, in essence, we might claim that those of us who are alive today have access to better and closer to what the Prophet of Islam actually revealed or intended as the religion of Islam than we would have had this event not happened, that it might have been lost to corruption, because the people he was standing against at that particular time, whether you're Sunni, Shia, whoever, for the most part, there's a pretty good understanding that these were pretty corrupt rulers that were not really good examples of what we like to think of as Islam. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. And then how did this evolve to what is going on today and what is going on today? So over time, back then, it's not like the instant that this event happened or even before it happened from the Prophet or from somebody else, peace be upon him and his family, there was, somebody saying, okay, this event happened and you need to remember it, and here's how you need to remember it. That's not the reality. There are some hadith that talk about various things that can be drawn to that conclusion to say, that it would be a good thing to remember this and to commemorate this and to draw lessons from it. But it was not spelled out, let's say, quite that clearly. But one can make such conclusions from the different sources that people have done so to kind of develop this tradition over time. And this tradition has evolved over time. So what it looked like, 100 years after the event compared to what it looks like now are not the same thing. And what it looks like now may vary on where you are, what part of the world you're in, what your culture is, what your language is, all of those kind of things. There are differences. But let's say from my perspective in, Western America, what you typically see is for the first 10 nights of Muharram, and sometimes maybe 12 nights, there are a series of lectures, either at the masjid or perhaps online, that you can watch, that the speaker tends to try to provide some inspiration that they then tie into the story of Karbala, this event that happened on Ashura in the month of Muharram. And it kind of has a format to it. Sometimes there's kind of some ways that it's involved where there's some traditions of this night we talk about this aspect of the story. There's no reason why it has to be that way. That's just customary. and it's not necessarily that way everywhere. And then there's some other things that can go on besides just lectures. There can be music. There can be, well, some wouldn't call it music. So but songs, music is the way I would term it. There can be poetry. There can be something called matam, beating of the chest, which some like, some don't like. There can be things more extreme than matam, such as cutting oneself. That is pretty rare in comparison, and not everyone agrees about, but you will find that in some places, in some people. And there can also be maybe plays, art, lots of different things that commemorate this event. There are some parallels to an extent in other faiths. Last year, I went to an Advent service with my mother because she wanted to go see one, and I had actually not been to one before, even though I was raised as a Christian. I guess the particular church I went to, we didn't go to church that much, but they did not have Advent, or they didn't. I don't recall it. But this Advent thing, it was kind of like an opening to the Christmas season. It was a way for people to come together. There was candle lighting. There were people reciting verses from the Bible about Jesus, peace be upon him, and the Christmas story in particular. And then there were Christmas carols. So there are similar traditions. We could pick different little aspects that happen in Muharram and point to different things that happen in other faiths, or maybe even in Sunni Islam somewhere on occasion. So this is not an entirely unique phenomenon. There are parallels in other faiths. Why is this a big deal? From a historical perspective, why is this a big deal? In my opinion, now Shias have always been a minority within a minority within a minority, with a couple notable exceptions over time. And they've often been oppressed, and they kind of gathered together and developed an identity around their relationship to certain people that they call the imams, who are relatives of the Prophet of Islam, that they believe were appointed to kind of protect that message from corruption and stand as role models on how to live that message. And so that identity that they attach to those, one of which is Imam Hussein, and the fact that they are a minority, that it kind of led to, over time, this event of remembering Muharram in some fashion, and those events that happened at Karbala on Ashura being a unifying factor, a way to survive as a group that has an identity over time, despite difficult conditions. And I think that added to its cultural importance over time. So that it is very much tied to a Shia identity, although there is nothing in Shia Islam that says observing Muharram in a particular fashion is obligatory. So not, unlike the month of Ramadan, where for many people, fasting is obligatory, something you're required to do. There's nothing in Shia Islam or elsewhere that says you must observe Muharram by doing certain things. Okay. So why would anyone want to be involved in this? And how do we get something out of it? So that's kind of what I'm going to talk about for the rest of the lecture. Not a lecture, conversation. So where is the spirituality for me personally? So Muharram is a thing that has very strong cultural ties. And so for me, who's someone who's not raised as a Muslim and not raised as a Shia, and then encountering Muharram for the first time, there were a lot of things that just felt kind of strange or didn't make sense, or you kind of wanted to know where that comes from, why is it done that way? And that can feel a little alienating sometimes, and it can get in the way of having a strong spiritual experience. And so I'm going to talk about some things to think about that might help with that. And then I'm going to talk about what works for some and not for others. Why does this even happen in the first place? And how does your own role or my role in that play into those things not speaking to you, and how can you address that? And how can you get something out of Muharram? Okay, so my own approach to a lot of things in life tends to be kind of rational, intellectual. It's the way I was raised. I think it might be just naturally in my personality. There are some very strong emotional components to some Muharram traditions, such as Matam, that maybe don't speak to me as well, because that's just kind of not my natural inclination. There are things that are cultural, like maybe a particular culture might make some flags or some emblems that they're going to use in a procession. And when I look at those things, they don't mean anything to me. They don't make me feel a certain way. They just seem kind of strange. Okay, so those kind of things can happen. So I tend to focus on what is the message that's being portrayed in a particular lecture or story, and what am I supposed to get out of that, and how can I use that to improve my own spirituality, my own practice. One issue that I think many people who come not from a Shia background initially, and even some that do, find not very well addressed, is there is a common claim, in terms of emphasis of Muharram and Ashura, that this event is unparalleled in history, that nothing like it ever happened before and ever will after. That's a pretty extraordinary claim when you look at other things in history through which there definitely can be some parallels made, such as there are other events that, or maybe even more extreme, there have been mass genocides where lots more people who were innocent, suffered. There have been other martyrdoms, even for the same faith, even, where they weren't seen as important. So the extraordinary claim is often not justified in what people present. I'm not saying there isn't a justification. I think it can be made, but for it being a singular event in history that had maybe some unique importance, that I think a lot of other people, that it's not naturally just understood. And I think it's often assumed to just be understood or obvious, and it is not. YouTube videos is kind of what a lot of us are doing this year. If you want to watch some lectures, different things like that. When I first became Muslim, YouTube videos were not yet a thing, because the internet was not yet capable of handling streaming video. But it is now. And so you'll find at the masjid sometimes, but also on YouTube videos, there's kind of been this tradition that has evolved where there'll be a lecture, and then toward the end of it, all of a sudden there's this transition, which is sometimes not so smooth, where the lights go dark and the speaker changes his voice to be kind of a wailing voice, and the mic is put on reverb, and the audience starts crying, and he starts recounting some of the tragic aspects of the story of what happened on Ashura. And this is something that always felt rather inauthentic to me. And so, to be honest, I often turn off a video at that point, because it doesn't speak to me emotionally the way I think it's intended to. And so I will often use other means if I want that emotional connection. And so I've heard a lot of other people mention that concern about this whole crying aspect and the whole mourning thing of Muharram, where it's really, really important, and it's like the main thing to some people who observe Muharram, and there are other people who just feel like they don't quite get it. And I can kind of be one of those, like on an intellectual level, I can maybe understand it. and I can feel things. It's not that I don't feel, but the methods used to make people feel sometimes just feel unauthentic to me. And I don't think the feeling is the end objective in and of itself. That's my personal opinion. And so to me, that's not the ultimate goal. It is maybe part of a process to achieve something else. And I'm not sure others always agree about that, or that's not always the way things are handled. And as some of us have experienced that people can be very touchy about these things, about the way things are done in Muharram, because they're such very strong traditions sometimes, and because they think that their way is the right way and the only way and the best way. And sometimes there's not a lot of openness there. And so that can be an issue that leads people to disconnect from this whole experience. And I want to kind of counter that and push back and say, maybe you don't need to just kind of throw in the towel that way. Maybe there's ways you can get something out of it. Okay, so why is it that some people get something out of something and others do not? So I think what we first need to look at is how do we get our understanding of what happened at Karbala in the first place? If we're going to make a claim that this is such an extraordinary event, that we need to remember it, that we need to commemorate it, that feeling something about it is important, that it is a model from which we can draw lessons that will lead to our own spiritual growth and benefit and our own practical Islamic growth. So if we're going to make these claims, I think we need to understand how do we know anything about what happened there, and keep that in mind when we're thinking about how things are presented. So first of all, there is a fact, a series of facts. There are some things that happened. We know that there was an event that happened at Karbala, and we know some details about that. We don't know the reality entirely. We were not there. So the information we get comes from some kind of records. So a hadith or oral traditions that were written down where people said, told somebody else this is what happened, and then it was written down. So historical records, historians recording events, at the time there was, maybe some strong oral traditions and things were not always written down right away. But in some cases, maybe they were. But in any case, these records do have some issues. So they may conflict with each other. They may be incomplete. They're definitely not exactly the same as the fact of whatever it is that happened. And then beyond that, so we have these records. Then there is cultural interpretation of records over 1,000 years. And that cultural interpretation, cultural filter, evolves over time. So two of the main influences on the cultural interpretations of Muharram would be the Abbasids and the Safavids. So these are two, let's say, Islamic eras with some Shia influence being particularly strong at that time. And we know that the lens that they put on things is different than the lens that we would put on things, but yet that lens kind of creeps into some of the materials, the interpretations of events, the way stories get told, sometimes as fact, but not actually being fact, so that we have emphasis on certain things, all of those, and even some fabrications. So all of that happens through, 1,000 years of cultural filter. And then there's the modern worldview, which is another cultural filter, the way we look at things, what we think is important, the way we understand something is different than done during either of those areas. And then we also have our own cultural lenses. So what works for someone raised in the United States, the way I understand things, what I think is right versus wrong, and what makes more sense to me, that may be slightly different than someone in a different part of the world or with a different personality. So we have all of these filters so that our understanding of Karbala is affected by all of those. And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind when you're, let's say, reading a book about Karbala or watching a lecture about it, that what you're not getting is that very first item in the list, the fact, okay? You're getting a filtering or a lens, an understanding of that is not perfect. Okay. And an important thing to bring up here is that the difference between sacred history and the stories being told about that event, we often confuse those and think they're the same thing, and they are not. If you're interested in this topic, there's a lecture by Enlos that I can send to you. But we need to understand that the sacred history is what actually happened, but the stories told are the meaning that we try to apply to it. Okay, and the meaning that the Abbasids applied to it is different from what the meaning that the Safavids applied to it versus the meaning that I might apply to it versus the meaning that somebody else might apply to it. Okay, so when you're listening to a lecture or reading a book, you need to be asking yourself, what is the story being told here? And why is that the story being told? Okay, because the story is different than what actually happened. So just as an example, 19th century piece of literature telling the story of Karbala, and it might talk about how the fact that Zainab, the sister of Imam Hussein, she and other women's hijab, their hair covering, was removed. And the fact that that happened, that might be fact, but then the interpretation of it and the emphasis put on it in that particular telling, it was such a calamity that the sun should eclipse because it shouldn't be exposed to these women with their hair exposed. Okay, so there is some subtext there that is trying to give a message that is an interpretation about what is important to take from this event. But there's not necessarily something in something that Imam Hussein said at the time, peace be upon him, or that any of the companions said, or that anything in the Quran says, or whatever, that makes that be the lesson that you're supposed to take from that event. Okay, so the lessons that we're drawing have to do with our filters. Now, different understandings of an imamate in religion can color this whole thing of why something works for us and not for someone else. So I'm just going to show you something here really quick. This was an article that was posted in our group by Mansour, our leader. 3 contemporary approaches to understanding the imama. So we're talking about Imam Hussein and the others who Shias believe have this role of role model, guiding, leading, and what they think exactly that means. There's differences of opinion about kind of the level of that leadership, and based on that difference of belief about that level of leadership and what you think that means, then the way you think about Muharram and what speaks to you might be different. So there are some people who kind of almost see these imams as being able to, for example, know the unseen, you know, almost as if they were divine, but they would say they're not divine, but they are given this ability through the, you know, by God. They're not gods themselves. And other things that seem kind of extraordinary. So they kind of have a cosmological level to their abilities and their leadership. Okay. Then there's kind of a middle approach where imama is the management of the people's worldly and religious affairs at the human social level, but not at the existential and cosmological level. Both of these, the first and the second, would believe in an obligation of love and attachment to them because these are your role models who sacrificed for you to enable you to have access to the truth. Okay, and so both of these groups might find some emphasis on Muharram and Ashura, that this love here could be a source of that emotional connection, the love that they feel for these. The third one, they might see them more as ordinary, quote unquote, ordinary people, where they are righteous scholars, they're authorities that provide guidance, but they're maybe not that different from any other number of authorities who provide guidance that you could refer to. So they might not have quite a special status. Okay. So depending on where you end up falling on that spectrum, if anywhere, then that might affect what makes you feel connected to Muharram and what doesn't, or the extent to which that happens. So as you're, consuming Muharram material, right, you're consumers of media, basically, I would ask you, is the story being told practical to you, and does it speak to you emotionally and spiritually? Does it make sense and seem right? Do you feel a sense of buy-in? If you're not sensing that, then you need to ask yourself why, and find something that does, because there's a variety of material out there. And maybe it's that you take something from a lecture, but you kind of don't buy into the whole thing, maybe. And that's okay too. So understanding your role and why things may or may not speak to you. You got to understand that as when you're reading a book or when you're listening to a lecture, you're trying to participate in the Muharram experience. This is not really a passive role. You have an active role as the participant in terms of how you filter that information and how you use it and how you emotionally connect with it. There are some choices you make there, sometimes consciously, sometimes unconsciously. So you need some self-awareness of what kind of things help you grow spiritually, help you feel that sense of connection, help you have that warm, fuzzy feeling inside, if we might call it that, however you might describe that. And you also need some contextual awareness of the background of where that information source that you are consuming comes from, compared to where you come from. So if something doesn't seem right to you, it feels uncomfortable, whatever that is, or it's just kind of blah. So you can think about this from that previous slide's lens of, what are the filters involved, what stories are being told, and how do those relate to me? What can I get out of it? And, is the story being told here something that can be useful to me? And then I ask you, who owns or decides what that story is? And there are multiple stories, really, right? We might have stories about bravery. We might have stories. There are also subtextual stories. For example, stories about the role of women or about the role of ethnic minorities that can be made from Karbala, sometimes implicitly rather than explicitly. And so you'll see some rather racist undertones, for example, to ways the stories were sometimes told, particularly, let's say, in the 19th century, but sometimes even still so today. And so, is that the story, or do you get to choose what story it is that you take from the events of Karbala that will have practical and spiritual benefit for you? So what themes and stories do you personally connect with? Not just what is being presented to you. So think about that. And so I propose that you get out of it what you put in. So first of all, can you be a good person, Muslim, Shia, whatever that is, without concerning yourself with Muharram at all? As I mentioned before, it's not obligatory, but it is an opportunity for spiritual benefit. Just like, let's say, the month of Ramadan and the things that go on then, some of the rituals, the practices, the behaviors that we engage in during that time can lead to a spiritual experience and can lead to a practical benefit in terms of your religious growth, okay? I find that if you're going to get something out of it, intellect and emotion both have to come into play. So if you're naturally more an emotional person and you connect to that side of it better, then you might ask yourself, okay, what is the intellectual piece that I need to focus on here to elevate my experience to the next level? Or, in my case, I need to focus on the emotional piece a little more and try to raise the bar for myself there. So what can I seek out, or how can I, adjust my attitude or anything like that in approaching this material to have that emotional sense that will enable me to more strongly connect with the story and the lessons that I'm supposed to take from it. Okay, so Muharram can be an extremely good vehicle for spiritual experience and practical reform. We see it's a huge phenomenon around the world. Arba'in, that 40-day event that I was talking about, it is probably not this year because of COVID-19, but normally there's a procession, people gathering there, pilgrimage, whatever you want to call it, that is larger than Hajj, larger than any other gathering like it in the world. So it is huge. So obviously there are many people who have a very strong spiritual experience from this, and hopefully who get some practical reform, some lessons that they can take into their own lives for their own benefit. So you get out of it what you put in. The more effort you make into thinking about the themes and stories that you will connect with, what is the message here, how can I use this, and how can I emotionally connect to it, you can have a higher level of experience than just passively consuming material or just ignoring it altogether. And that's true whether you are Shia